The horse was the color of dust, and so was the man who rode it. Eli Rollins came into the town of Redemption with the sun at his back, a sun that had forgotten how to be gentle. It baked the land into a cracked, pale thing, and it bleached the hope from the faces of the few people who dared to walk the single, wide street. Redemption was a town gasping for breath. The wells were nearly dry, the creek bed a scar of pale stones, and the only reliable water flowed from a spring on Amos Rigg's land. Rigg owned the spring, the general store, the livery, and the silence in men's eyes when his name was spoken. Eli's gaze swept over the town, missing nothing. He saw the peeling paint on the church steeple, the listless sag of the saloon doors, the thin, hungry dogs that watched him pass with more weariness than interest. This was a place where hope had packed its bags and left on the last stagecoach. It was a place like a dozen others he had seen, a place to water his horse and move on. He had been moving on for 5 years, ever since the fire. The fire had taken everything but the memory of smoke in his lungs and the weight of a silence where a woman's laugh and a child's cry used to be. He no longer looked for a place to stay. He looked for a place to leave. He swung down from his horse, the leather of his saddle groaning like a tired man. The animal drank greedily from the public trough, the water level low and scummy. Eli felt the town's eyes on him. They were the eyes of wary folk, suspicious of any stranger who carried a colt on his hip and a shadow in his soul. He was not looking for trouble, but he had a long memory of what trouble looked like, and redemption was simmering with it. The saloon was the only place that seemed to have any life, and it was a mean, sour kind of life. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies. A few listless cattle hands nursed warm beers at the bar. At a corner table, a man with a face like a clenched fist was holding a boy by the scruff of his neck. The boy couldn't have been more than 12. His face streaked with dirt and tears. A burlap sack of supplies spilled at his feet. "You think you can just walk out of here without paying your father's tab, boy?" the man growled. He was one of Rigg's men, a foreman named Jed. Eli had seen his type before, a bully who mistook cruelty for strength. "Pa gave me the money for the flour and beans," the boy whimpered, his voice thin as a thread. "He said he paid you last week." "Your PA is a liar and a cheat," Jed snarled, shaking the boy so hard his teeth rattled. "And I'm going to teach you a lesson about paying your debts." He raised a meaty hand. Eli moved without thinking. It was an old instinct, the one that had made him a lawman once, in a life before the fire. He did not say a word. He simply crossed the room in 3 long strides and clamped his hand around Jed's wrist. His grip was like iron. Jed spun around, his eyes wide with surprise and fury. "Who in the hell are you?" "The man who's telling you to let the boy go," Eli said. His voice was quiet, low and rough like stones rubbing together. It held no threat, only a flat statement of fact. Jed sneered, trying to wrench his wrist free. "This ain't your business, drifter." "You made it my business when you put your hands on a child." The foreman's face purpled with rage. He was bigger than Eli, broader in the shoulders, but there was a stillness in Eli's gray eyes that gave him pause. It was the stillness of a man who had seen the worst of things and was not afraid of seeing them again. With his free hand, Jed lunged for his pistol. He was fast, but Eli was faster. Eli twisted Jed's wrist, a sharp, clean movement that sent a spike of pain up the man's arm. Jed howled, his fingers uncurling from his gun. Eli shoved him backward, sending him stumbling into the table, which crashed to the floor in a splinter of wood and glass. Jed landed in a heap, clutching his arm, his face a mask of disbelief. Eli did not even look at him. He turned to the boy, who was staring, wide-eyed. Eli knelt and began gathering the spilled flour and beans, his large, calloused hands moving with a gentle purpose. "This yours?" he asked softly. The boy nodded, unable to speak. Eli stood and handed the sack to him. He reached into his own pocket, pulled out $2 silver, and slapped them on the bar. "This should cover what the boy's father owes," he said to the bartender, who was polishing a glass as if nothing had happened. Then he looked at the boy. "Go on home now." The boy fled without a backward glance. The saloon was silent, save for Jed's groaning. Eli walked out into the punishing sun, mounted his horse, and rode away from the center of town, feeling the weight of new eyes on him. Some held gratitude, others a new and dangerous suspicion. From the window of a small, weathered shack on the edge of town, Cora Langley had watched the dusty rider arrive. She had not seen the trouble in the saloon, but she heard about it soon enough. News in Redemption traveled on the wind, and it was always colored with fear or malice. They said a stranger had broken Jed's arm. They said he was a gunslinger, a man looking for a fight. Cora knew better than to trust gossip. She had been the subject of it for 2 long years. Ever since her husband, Jeremiah, had wrapped his wagon around an old cottonwood, dead from a bottle of whiskey before he even hit the tree. She had been left with nothing but his debts, a patch of useless, sun-hardened land, and the pitying, judgmental stares of the townswomen. She watched the stranger now as he made a small, lonely camp near the dry creek bed. He moved with a quiet efficiency, tending to his horse with a care that spoke of a deep, practiced bond. He was tall and lean, his shoulders straight despite the weariness that seemed to cling to him like his dusty coat. There was a harshness to the line of his jaw, but a sorrow in the way he held himself when he thought no one was watching. She saw him stare out at the blood-red sunset, his hands resting on his thighs, and for a long moment, he did not move, a silhouette of grief against the dying light. Cora felt a flicker of something she had not felt in years. Curiosity. It was a dangerous feeling for a woman like her, a woman who had learned that the only safety was in being invisible. But she could not look away. He was a stone tossed into the stagnant pond of her life, and she found herself watching for the ripples. On Sunday, Cora went to church. She did it out of habit, a ritual inherited from her mother that felt more like a duty than a comfort. She sat alone in the back pew, a small island in a sea of families. The other women, in their starched bonnets and faded Sunday best, clustered together, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves. Cora kept her eyes fixed on the stained glass window, a depiction of a shepherd and his flock that seemed to mock the drought-ravaged land outside. Then the church door opened, letting in a shaft of blinding light, and the stranger stepped inside. He took off his hat, revealing dark, sweat-dampened hair, and stood for a moment, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He was out of place, a wolf in a sheep pen, and every head turned to stare. He ignored them, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on her, alone in the back. He did not smile or nod. He simply held her gaze for a half-second, a flicker of acknowledgement from one outcast to another, before taking a seat across the aisle. During the Reverend Miller's sermon about faith in times of trial, Cora was intensely aware of him. She could feel the stillness of him, the coiled energy he held in check. She heard the whispers from the pew in front of her. "That's him, the one who hurt Jed. Look at him, hard as a coffin nail." And sitting right near her, I suppose. The woman's companion sniffed. Poor Jeremiah. At least he's at peace now. It can't have been easy, being married to a woman like that. They say she's unnatural, never did cry at the funeral. And barren, too. Not a child in 5 years of marriage. She has no dowry, not a penny to her name. She'll die alone in that shack. Cora's hands tightened in her lap, her knuckles white. She was used to the talk, but it still felt like swallowing shards of glass. She had cried for Jeremiah, but not for the man he had become. She had wept for the gentle boy she had married, the one who had been beaten out of him by bad liquor and a bitter heart. She did not cry at his grave because her tears had run dry long before he died. As for being unnatural, perhaps they were right. She had learned to be hard because softness was a luxury she could not afford. When the service ended, Eli was gone before the final amen had faded. Cora slipped out quickly, avoiding the forced, tight-lipped smiles and the cold shoulders of the congregation. She was halfway home when the sky turned a sickening shade of yellow-brown. The wind, which had been a hot, steady breath all morning, began to howl, picking up dust and grit from the parched earth. A sandstorm. It came on fast, a moving wall of dirt that blotted out the sun and scoured the world clean. Cora ran, her skirt whipping around her legs, the sand stinging her face and blinding her. Her small shack was too far. She spotted the silhouette of the old Miller barn, abandoned for years, and stumbled toward it, pushing open the heavy, groaning door and falling inside just as the full fury of the storm hit. The barn was dark and smelled of hay rot and thyme. For a moment, she leaned against the door, her chest heaving, listening to the roar of the wind. She was not alone. From the deeper shadows, a figure emerged. It was him, Eli Rollins. "Looks like you had the same idea," he said. His voice was calm, a low rumble beneath the shriek of the storm. Cora straightened, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It came on fast." "They do, out here." He gestured toward a stack of old hay bales. "Might as well get comfortable. This could take a while." She sat on a separate bale, a good 10 feet from him, wrapping her arms around her knees. The air was thick with dust that had seeped through the cracks in the walls. Light filtered through in thin, hazy stripes. In the strange, dim light, she could see the lines etched around his eyes, the faint white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He was not a handsome man in the way the town dandies were, but his face had a strength to it, a history. "You're the man from the saloon," she said, her voice stiffer than she intended. "I am." He did not elaborate. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the storm. It was not an easy silence. It was taut, wary. "They're saying you broke Jed's arm," she finally said, needing to fill the space. "His wrist," Eli corrected. "And he was the one who decided it should be broken." He leaned back against a wooden post, his long legs stretched out before him. "Folks in this town seem to like their stories simple." Cora thought of the whispers in the church. "Yes," she said quietly. "They do." He looked at her then, a direct, assessing gaze that made her feel as if he could see right through the careful walls she had built around herself. "You live out on the edge of town, alone." It was not a question. "I do." "Not an easy place for a woman by herself." A spark of defiance flared in her. "I manage." He nodded slowly, his eyes dropping to her hands, which were clenched in her lap. They were not the soft, pale hands of the other church ladies. They were chapped and capable, with calluses on the palms and dirt under the nails. "I expect you do," he said, and for the first time, she felt he was not pitying her, but seeing her. The storm raged for another hour. They did not speak again. They were two strangers, sharing a small, dark space, each locked in their own private world of pain. When the wind finally died down to a mournful sigh, Eli rose to his feet. "It's past," he said. He slid the heavy door open. The world outside was transformed, coated in a fresh layer of red dust, the air sharp and clean. He stepped out, then turned back to her. "Ma'am." He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod and walked away toward his camp without looking back. That night, sleep did not come easy to Cora. When it finally did, it was filled with dreams. She dreamt of the barn, of the storm, but this time he was closer. She dreamt of his hands. She saw them calming his horse, gathering the spilled flour, resting on his thighs as he watched the sun set. They were big, rough hands, scarred and sun-browned. But in her dream, they were gentle. They reached for her. Not with violence or drunken fumbling like Jeremiah's had, but with a slow, deliberate tenderness that made her heart ache. She woke with a gasp, the feeling of his touch still lingering on her skin, a phantom warmth in the cold. Empty bed. Miles away, at his camp under a blanket of stars. Eli Rollins also dreamed. He was standing on the bank of a river, but the water was not water. It was a churning dark river of blood. On the other side, his wife, Sarah, stood in her white cotton dress, her blonde hair catching a light that did not exist. Beside her was their son, Luke, clutching her hand, his small face pale and solemn. They did not speak, they just watched him. Sarah raised a hand, not to wave, but to beckon. "Come to us," her eyes said, but he could not move. His boots were filled with lead, rooted to the blood-soaked ground. He opened his mouth to call her name, but all that came out was smoke and ash, the taste of the fire that had taken them, the fire that had forged the river between them. He woke with a raw cry lodged in his throat, the cold sweat on his brow real, the emptiness beside him a familiar and crushing weight. A few days later, the Reverend Miller sought Eli out at his camp. The preacher was a thin, earnest man whose faith was being eroded by the endless drought. "Mr. Rollins," he began, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands, "I'll not mince words. This town is on a knife's edge. The drought is bad enough, but now we have bandits. They've been hitting the supply wagons coming from the east, stealing what little water and food we can get." Eli tossed the dregs of his coffee into the fire. "What's that got to do with me?" "The town council, such as it is, voted to hire a man to guard the town well at night. It's nearly dry, but it's all we have that Rig doesn't own. The last man we hired was scared off." The Reverend looked Eli square in the eye. "You don't seem like a man who scares easy. We can't pay much, but we can pay." Eli was already shaking his head. "I'm not a guard, and I'm not looking for work. I'm just passing through." The words were automatic, the creed he had lived by for 5 years. Don't get involved. Don't put down roots. Roots only burn. "I saw what you did for the Miller boy in the saloon," the preacher pressed. "This town needs a man like you, even if it's just for a few weeks, until the rains come, or until the circuit judge arrives." Eli thought of the boy's terrified face. He thought of the whispers in the church, the palpable fear that clung to redemption like the dust. He did not want this. He did not want to be a part of their slow dying. But as he looked at the preacher's desperate face, he heard a faint echo of his own past, of a time when he believed in duty, in protecting the weak, against his better judgment, against every instinct that screamed at him to ride on. He heard himself say, "1 week, that's all." His new job was as grim as the town itself. He spent his nights sitting by the stone well, a shotgun across his lap, watching the shadows and listening to the coyotes. It was on the 3rd night that the trouble he was paid to prevent found him in an unexpected way. A noise from the edge of town, near the Langley place. Not bandits, but a single thief, trying to get into Cora's chicken coop. Eli moved like a ghost through the darkness. He was close enough to see the man. A scrawny farmhand he recognized as one of Rig's lackeys. When his boot snagged on something in the dark, he looked down and saw a woman's form lying on the ground, dangerously still. The thief heard the noise and fled into the night. Eli forgot him instantly. He knelt, his heart suddenly pounding in his chest. It was Cora. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch, her breathing shallow. Heat stroke. In this country, it could kill as quick as a bullet. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with delirium. She stared up at the dark shape of him looming over her. "Please," she whispered, her voice a dry, rasping sound, a prayer to a faceless God. "Don't leave me." He did not hesitate. He slid one arm under her back and the other beneath her knees. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight of bone and desperation. He lifted her easily, her head falling back against his shoulder. Her nearness was a jolt to his system, the scent of lavender and dust, the feel of her warm breath against his neck. It was an intimacy he had not known for 5 years, and it terrified him as much as it felt like coming home. He carried her across the yard to her dark shack, shouldered the door open, and stepped inside. He crossed the threshold of her home, a stranger carrying a broken woman, and laid her gently on her narrow bed. The ghosts of his wife and son watching him from the shadows of his own haunted heart. Cora came to in the gray light of pre-dawn, the world swimming slowly back into focus. A damp cloth was on her forehead, and a strange weightlessness possessed her limbs. For a moment, she felt a disorienting peace, a surrender she had not known in years. Then memory returned in a hot, shameful flush. The darkness, the stumbling weakness, the sound of her own voice pleading with a stranger. She sat up too quickly, the room tilting. A tin cup of water sat on the crate beside her bed. She drank it down, the cool liquid a shock to her parched throat. The shack was empty, but he had been there. A bucket of fresh water from the town well stood by the door, and the chickens had been fed, their soft clucking a familiar morning sound. He had taken care of things. The thought was both a comfort and a humiliation. She was a woman who took care of herself. She had survived Jeremiah's drinking, his moods, his fists. She had survived his death and the town's scorn. She had survived 2 years of relentless, grinding solitude, to be found collapsed in her own yard, to be carried and tended to like a helpless child, was a crack in the armor she had so carefully forged. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady. She had to set this right. She could not be indebted to him. She looked around her small, sparse home for something, anything, of value. Her eyes fell on the high shelf above the hearth. There, catching the first rays of morning sun, sat a single glass jar. It was her last jar of blackberry jam. Put up the summer Jeremiah died. She remembered the heat of that day, the sweat trickling down her back as she stirred the pot, the sweet, thick scent filling the small cabin. It had been a good year for berries. It was the last good thing she could remember. The jar was more than preserved fruit. It was a season of her life sealed under wax, a memory of a time before the silence had become permanent. It was all she had to offer. She found Eli at his camp, crouched by a small fire, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up as she approached, his face unreadable in the morning light. He had the kind of stillness that made the world around him seem loud and clumsy. "Mr. Rawlins," she said, her voice sounding small in the vast, quiet landscape. "Ma'am," he acknowledged, his eyes taking in her pale face, the slight tremor in her hands. She held out the jar. "This is for your trouble, for the water, for last night." He looked at the jar of jam, then back at her. A flicker of something, perhaps understanding, passed through his gray eyes. He did not reach for it. There was no trouble. "Please," she insisted, pushing it a little closer. "I don't accept charity." "It wasn't charity," he said, his voice low and even. "It was a dipper of water and a walk across a yard. That's not a thing that gets paid for." Her arm began to feel heavy. The jam, which had felt like a worthy offering, now seemed a foolish, sentimental gesture. "It's good jam," she said quietly. "From my own bushes." "I'm sure it is," he said, and his voice was not unkind. "But I can't take it. I'll be moving on soon. A man traveling light has no place for things in glass jars." The rejection was gentle, but it stung. He was reminding her of what she already knew. He was a drifter, a ghost who would soon disappear. She was a woman anchored to a patch of worthless dirt. Their paths were not meant to cross for long. She pulled the jar back, clutching it to her chest like a shield. "As you wish," she said, her voice stiff with bruised pride. She turned and walked back to her shack, the morning sun feeling suddenly harsh and unforgiving. 2 days later, a buggy pulled up outside her gate, a fine, black-lacquered thing drawn by a horse as sleek and well-fed as its owner. Amos Riggs stepped out. He was a man who seemed to absorb the very light around him. dressed in a black suit despite the oppressive heat. His face was fleshy, his eyes small and shrewd, and he smiled a smile that never reached them. Mrs. Langley, he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He removed his hat, but the gesture held no real respect. I trust I find you well. Cora stood on her porch, her arms crossed. She did not invite him in. What do you want, Mr. Rigg? Direct. I appreciate that in a woman. He let his gaze drift over her property, a look of faint disgust on his face as he took in the peeling whitewash of the shack, the withered garden, the dust. I've come to repeat my offer for your land. It's a generous one, considering its condition. Enough for you to buy a ticket on the stagecoach and start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere greener. The implication was clear. Somewhere she would not be a blight on his town. My answer is the same as it was last spring, Mr. Rigg. The land is not for sale. His smile tightened. This land is useless. The creek's been dry for a year. Nothing will grow here but misery. Your husband, God rest his soul, knew that. He was ready to sell before his accident. My husband is gone, she said, her voice cold. I make my own decisions now. A poor decision, Riggs said, his voice losing its veneer of civility. I am trying to improve this town. Mrs. Langley, I am trying to bring in new investors, men who will build things. Your stubbornness is an obstacle to progress. I am prepared to offer you $5 an acre. That is my final offer. Take it, or you may find the misery I spoke of grows deeper than you can imagine. This is my home, she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. It was a miserable home, but it was hers. It was the only ground in the world that she could stand on and not be told to move. I am not selling. Now please get off my property. For a long moment, he stared at her, his small eyes hardening into chips of black stone. Then, he put his hat back on, turned without another word, and climbed into his buggy. As he drove away, the dust stirred by his wheels seemed to settle on everything, leaving a film of grime that felt like a threat. That night, Cora sat in the dark, unable to sleep. The memory of Rigg's face hung in her mind. Around midnight, a sound split the silence, the sharp crack of a rifle, followed by the tinkle and shatter of glass. She screamed, dropping to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs. A bullet had torn through the window, burying itself in the wall just above where her head had been. She lay on the rough floorboards, shaking, listening to the sound of a horse galloping away into the darkness. She was alone, and she had never felt so terrified. The next day, Eli heard the story at the general store. The whispers were laced with a cruel satisfaction. Amos Rigg's clerk was telling anyone who would listen that Cora Langley was a foolish woman who had brought trouble on herself. Eli paid for his tin of beans, his face a stony mask, but a cold anger was coiling in his gut. He had told himself he would not get involved. He had told himself he was just passing through. He was a liar. He walked to her shack that evening, just as the sun was bleeding across the horizon. She was on the porch, a shotgun across her lap, her face pale and drawn. She had nailed a piece of board over the broken window. She watched him approach, her eyes narrowed with suspicion and fear. What do you want? Heard you had some trouble last night, he said, stopping at the bottom of her steps. I handled it. Her voice was brittle. With a piece of wood and a shotgun you might not know how to fire, he asked, his gaze resting on the weapon. He could see the tension in her knuckles, the fear she was trying so hard to hide. Heard it was Rigg's men. She did not answer, just stared out at the fading light. Eli sighed, the sound rough in the evening air. I'm guarding the well at night. It's not far from here. It wouldn't be any trouble for me to sit here on your porch instead. Just for tonight. She looked at him then, her defenses starting to crumble. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the terror she had been holding at bay all day. Why? She whispered. Why would you do that? He did not have an answer. not one he was willing to speak aloud. He thought of the fire, of the night he had been too late to protect his own family. He had been running from that failure for 5 years. Maybe, just for one night, he wanted to stop running. Because no woman should have to face the dark alone when there are men with guns in it, he said simply. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him. The last of her strength seemed to drain away, leaving behind a raw, aching vulnerability. She stood up and walked to him, stopping so close he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. She reached out a trembling hand and laid it flat against his chest. Through the thin cotton of his shirt, she could feel the steady, solid beat of his heart. It was the most real thing she had felt all day. "Stay until I break," she murmured, her voice so low it was almost lost to the wind. It was not a request. It was a confession. He looked down at her hand on his chest, then into her eyes. He should have said no. He should have tipped his hat and walked away, but he did not. He simply nodded. "All right," he said. He stayed. As darkness fell completely, he took a seat on the top step of her porch, his back against a post, his rifle resting beside him. Cora brought out a blanket and a cup of coffee, setting it down near him before retreating back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. Later, a storm rolled in from the west. The sky lit up with silent flashes of heat lightning, and a low, distant rumble of thunder echoed across the plains. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of rain that had not yet fallen. Cora came back out and sat on the other side of the porch, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. For a long time, they watched the storm approach in silence. "I used to like the thunder," Eli said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to be part of the storm itself. "When I was a boy, my PA told me it was God rearranging the furniture in heaven." He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I used to believe in God. I believed he was just and fair. I believed that if you worked hard and did right by people, you'd be rewarded." Another rumble of thunder, closer this time. "Then, one afternoon, I was riding with a posse, chasing down some raiders who'd hit a homestead 10 miles from my own. We were gone 2 days. When I got back, there was nothing left, just smoke and black timbers. The raiders had circled back. They took everything." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as if he were reciting a story that had happened to someone else. "My wife, my boy. The fire took them both. I prayed then. I got down on my knees in the ashes and I begged God to make it a nightmare, to let me wake up. But the only answer I got was the silence." He fell quiet, the words hanging in the heavy air between them. "I stopped believing in a just God that day. A fair one would have taken me, too." Cora listened, her heart aching for the man beside her, for the unimaginable loss that had hollowed him out. His grief was so vast and empty, it made her own sorrows feel small and manageable. When he finished, she did not offer empty words of comfort. She offered him the truth. "I stopped praying a long time ago, too," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "But it wasn't because of one big thing. It was because of 1,000 little ones. It was every time Jeremiah came home with liquor on his breath and anger in his eyes. I would pray for him to be the man I married again. I'd pray for him to stop. Then, when the praying didn't work, I'd just pray for him not to hurt me too bad." She pulled the blanket tighter. "I realized one night, after I was lying on the floor, that no one was listening. There was no one coming to save me from the man I'd married. I was on my own. So I stopped asking." In the echoing silence that followed their confessions, a new kind of intimacy was born. They were no longer just a drifter and a widow. They were 2 survivors, 2 people who had looked into the abyss and found it empty. A flash of lightning illuminated the porch, and in that stark, white light, their eyes met. Slowly, Cora reached out and cupped his jaw with her hand. His skin was rough with stubble, his face hard and angular. But beneath her palm, she felt a tremor run through him. He was not made of stone. After all, he was made of flesh and blood, and a pain so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. For a heartbeat. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing. A shudder went through his powerful frame. Then, as if her touch had burned him, he pulled back sharply. He stood up, turning away from her to face the storm, his shoulders rigid. He was shaken, terrified by the sudden, unexpected jolt of human connection. "The rain's coming," he said, his voice rough. "You should go inside." Cora stood, her hands still tingling from the feel of him. She wanted to say something, but the words would not come. She retreated into the darkness of her shack, the moment of tenderness broken, leaving a fragile ache in its place. The next morning, she woke to the sound of a rooster crowing. The air was clean and cool, washed by the night's rain. She went to the porch, a knot of anxiety in her stomach. He was gone. The cup was empty, the blanket folded neatly on the step. There was no sign he had ever been there, except for the tracks his boots had left in the damp earth, leading away from her house, away from the town. She watched the empty road until the sun was fully risen, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The town, however, had not missed his presence. The gossip started before noon. It spread like a brush fire, fanned by the righteous winds of small-town morality. By the time Cora walked to the store for flour, she could feel the change. The whispers were louder, the stares more pointed. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, saw her coming and deliberately crossed the street to avoid her. Outside the store, a group of children were playing. As she passed, one of the older boys, son of one of Riggs' men, picked up a stone and threw it. It clattered against her wooden gate, a small, sharp sound of contempt. The other children giggled. Cora kept walking, her head held high, but the stone had felt as if it had struck her in the chest. Later that afternoon, Reverend Miller appeared at her door. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes shifting around as if looking for an escape. "Mrs. Langley," he said, clearing his throat. "I've come as a friend." Cora knew this was a lie. He had come as the town's conscience. "There is talk," he continued, unable to meet her gaze. "About the drifter, Mr. Rollins, about him spending the night here." "He sat on my porch. Reverend," she said, her voice flat. "Someone had shot out my window the night before. I was afraid." "Be that as it may," the preacher said, his tone turning stern. "Appearances matter. You are a widow, living alone. A woman in your position must be beyond reproach. To associate with a man of his reputation is to invite judgment. Women like you shouldn't tempt fate. Women like me," the words hung in the air, dripping with condemnation. "Widowed, childless, poor, defiant." "Thank you for your concern, Reverend," she said, her voice cold enough to freeze water. She closed the door in his face, her hands shaking with a rage that was colder and purer than her fear had ever been. That evening, she sat in her chair, the shotgun once again on her lap, watching the light fade from the sky. She did not know what she would do. She only knew that she would not be driven out. She would sit here, on her worthless patch of land, until she turned to dust herself. She must have dozed off, because a soft sound from the porch startled her awake. She grabbed the shotgun, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure stood in the open doorway, silhouetted against the deep indigo of the twilight sky. It was Eli. He did not look at her. He looked at the lock on the door, then back out into the darkness he had just come from. He had not come for a grand reunion, or for an apology. He had come back for a reason as simple and solid as the earth beneath his feet. "You forgot to lock your door," he said. And with those 5 words, the world shifted. He had not left her after all. He had come back. He came back, and he stayed. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as quiet and steady as a heartbeat in a sleeping house. It was a routine born not of words, but of necessity and a silent, mutual understanding. Each morning, before the sun had baked the mercy from the air, Eli would arrive with 2 heavy buckets of water from the town well, his boots making soft thuds in the dust. He would leave them on her porch, and by the time he returned from whatever small jobs he could find, mending a fence for a farmer, cleaning out the livery, one of the buckets would be gone, and in its place would be a small parcel wrapped in cloth. Sometimes it was a slice of fresh cornbread, still warm and smelling of hearth and home. Other times it was a handful of eggs from her scrawny but determined chickens. Once a week, he would bring a sack of supplies, flour, beans, salt, bought with the meager pay he earned guarding the well. He never handed them to her directly. He would leave them by the door. And later, he would find one of his shirts, which she had taken from his saddle roll while he was away, returned to him. The torn seam under the arm stitched with small, neat, nearly invisible stitches. She mended the parts of him that were frayed, and he provided the substance that kept her from collapsing. They rarely spoke of the arrangement. There were no thank yous, no discussions of payment. Theirs was a language of gestures, a barter of care against the harsh currency of the world. He was the outer wall, the man who stood between her and the darkness. She was the inner fire, the small, steady flame that offered a sliver of warmth in his cold and empty life. The town watched, of course. Their disapproval was a constant, palpable thing, a third presence in the quiet space between the shack and Eli's camp. Cora felt their stares when she walked to the mercantile, and Eli heard their muttering when he bought his coffee. They were 2 outcasts who had found a strange, fragile shelter in each other, and for that, they would not be forgiven. One evening, a week after he returned, the air held a rare coolness, a breeze that had traveled a long way, over mountains and plains, whispered through the dry grass. They sat on the porch steps, watching the stars begin to prick holes in the deep velvet of the sky. For a long time, the only sounds were the crickets and the distant howl of a lone coyote. "I had a son," Eli said into the darkness. The words came out of him rough and unused, as if he had dug them up from a place deep inside himself. His name was Luke. He was 6 years old. Cora did not move, did not breathe. She knew this was a sacred confidence, a key to a room he kept locked and bolted against the world. He had his mother's hair, the color of corn silk, but he had my eyes. Eli's voice was a low, aching monotone. He was afraid of snakes, but not of thunderstorms. He liked to collect smooth, flat rocks from the creek bed. He wanted to be a lawman, like me. He had a toy pistol carved from a piece of wood. I made it for him. He stopped, his throat working. He was not looking at her, but at some point far away in the past, a point only he could see. The day of the fire, I found his little wooden gun in the ashes. It was all that was left of him. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of a small, 6-year-old ghost. Cora felt a profound sorrow for him, an empathy that went deeper than pity. He had shared the sharpest edge of his pain with her. She owed him the same. "I can't have children," she said, her voice a thread of sound. "Jeremiah, my husband, he had a bad temper when he drank, and he drank most nights." She paused, gathering her courage. It was a shame she had never spoken aloud to another living soul. One winter, he got angry about the cost of feed for the horse. He was not himself. He hit me, and I fell. He kicked me. After the doctor came, he told me that the damage was permanent, that my body was broken in a way that could never be mended. He said I would never carry a child. She finished speaking and braced herself for the reaction she had always expected, the flinch of disgust, the awkward pity, the confirmation of what the town already whispered, that she was damaged, unnatural, less than a whole woman. Eli was silent for a long moment. Then he turned his head and looked at her, his gray eyes clear and steady in the starlight. He did not flinch. He did not look away. "You're more whole than anyone I've ever met," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. They were the opposite of everything she had ever been told. of everything she had come to believe about herself. He saw not her brokenness, but her survival. He saw the strength it took to endure, not the weakness of being shattered. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and sharp. For the first time since Jeremiah's funeral, she felt the sting of tears she might actually let fall. She began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable shaking that started in her hands and spread through her entire body. It was a tremor of released grief, of shock, of a hope so fragile she was terrified it would break. Eli saw the shaking. He shifted closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if approaching a frightened animal. He raised his hand and gently cupped her shoulder. His touch was firm, grounding. It was not a gesture of passion, but of comfort, a solid anchor in the storm that was raging inside her. The warmth of his palm seeped through the thin fabric of her dress, a simple, human heat that felt more profound than any embrace she had ever known. The trembling eased, slowly, tentatively. She leaned into his touch. She leaned into the solid strength of him, the quiet acceptance. Her head tilted, her lips parted slightly. He turned his face toward hers, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the soft warmth of his breath. The world seemed to stop. There was only the starlight, the scent of dust and pine, and the silent, desperate question hanging in the air between them. A kiss. It was there, waiting, a breath away, but they stopped. It was he who pulled back first, a barely perceptible retreat. But it was enough. The spell was broken. He was a man who had sworn off hope, and she was a woman who was terrified of it. A kiss would be a promise, and neither of them knew how to make promises anymore. He dropped his hand from her shoulder, and the space between them once again felt like a vast, empty canyon. A few days later, the fragile peace they had built was shattered. Cora had walked to town for thread, her steps lighter than they had been in years. Eli's words had been a shield, deflecting the cold stares and the whispered insults. She did not care what they thought. She was not the broken thing they saw. She was whole. The walk home was long and hot. The sun beat down, and the road was empty. She was a quarter of a mile from her shack when she heard footsteps behind her, fast and heavy. Before she could turn, a man grabbed her, one hand clamping over her mouth, the other twisting her arm behind her back. It was Caleb, a lanky, slack-jawed farmhand who worked for Amos Rigg. She had seen him in town, his eyes always lingering on her with a sneering insolence. Mister, Rigg says you need to learn some respect. Widow, he hissed in her ear, his breath sour. He dragged her off the road, into a thicket of scrub oak and mesquite. She fought, kicking and struggling, but he was strong. He threw her to the ground, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Her small parcel of thread burst, the spools scattering in the dust like fallen tears. He fell upon her, his weight crushing, his hands tearing at her dress. She screamed against his palm, a muffled, desperate sound of pure terror. Eli found her an hour later. He had been coming back from a day's work and had seen the spools of thread glinting on the dusty road. A cold dread had seized him. He had followed the drag marks into the thicket. She was huddled at the base of a tree, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking back and forth. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Her lip was split and bleeding, and there was a dark, ugly bruise blooming on her cheek. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart. They were wide and vacant, staring at nothing, her body shaking in a violent, unending tremor. He approached her slowly, his rage a cold, hard stone in his belly. "Cora," he said softly. She flinched, a small, wounded animal. She looked at him, but he was not sure she was really seeing him. "He's gone," Eli said, his voice gentle. "You're safe." "Don't," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Don't call the sheriff. Please. They'll say I asked for it. They'll say I deserved it." The shame, the terror of the town's judgment, was as great as the violation itself. Eli's jaw tightened until it ached. He knew she was right. Sheriff Brody was Riggs' man, and the town's morality was a cruel, twisted thing. There would be no justice for her here, only more humiliation. "All right," he said. He knelt in front of her and held out his hand. "Let's go home." It took her a long moment to respond. Then, slowly, she placed her trembling hand in his. He helped her to her feet, and she leaned on him heavily as they walked the short distance back to the shack. He half carried her inside and helped her into a chair before fetching a basin of water and a clean cloth. He said nothing as he gently dabbed at the cut on her lip. His silence was more comforting than any words could have been. It was a silence that did not judge, that did not question. It simply was. He stayed with her through the night. She would not go to bed, but sat in the chair by the cold hearth, staring into the darkness. The violent shivers did not stop. She would clench her hands so tightly her nails dug into her palms, her body racked with the aftershocks of the assault. Eli pulled another chair close and sat with her. After a while, he gently took her hands in his. He did not stroke them or try to soothe her. He just held them, his large, warm hands enveloping hers, preventing her from hurting herself. A steady, silent presence in the long, terrifying dark. He sat there for hours, a sleepless guardian, his anger hardening into a cold, diamond-sharp resolve. The next morning, the first light of dawn crept through the window, painting the room in pale, gray stripes. Cora had finally drifted into an exhausted, twitching sleep. The bruise on her cheek was now a deep, lurid purple against her pale skin. Eli had not moved. He watched her, his face grim. He had run from violence once, and it had cost him everything. He would not run again. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttered open and found his. They were filled with a deep, weary pain, but the vacant terror was gone. He had stayed. He reached out, his touch feather-light, and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her bruised face. His fingers were rough and calloused, but his touch was incredibly tender. "Do you still want me to stay?" he asked, his voice low and raspy from the long night's silence. He was asking more than if she wanted him there in that moment. He was asking if she was ready for the war that was coming. His staying was no longer a quiet arrangement. It was a declaration. She looked at him, at the unwavering resolve in his gray eyes, at the protector who had sat with her through the darkest night of her life. She was broken, bruised, and terrified. But for the first time, she was not alone. "Yes," she whispered. He gave a single, sharp nod. He stood up, placed his rifle by the door, and walked out of the shack. He did not walk toward his camp. He walked toward town. He found Caleb at the saloon, bragging to a few of Riggs' other men. He was drinking whiskey, his voice loud and boastful. Eli walked straight to him. He did not say a word. He simply grabbed Caleb by the front of his shirt, hauled him out into the dusty street, and hit him. It was not a fight. It was a reckoning. Eli's fists landed with a brutal, methodical precision. He struck Caleb's sneering face, his soft belly, his jaw. Caleb went down in a heap, spitting blood and teeth into the dust. Eli stood over him, his chest heaving, his hands raw, the cold rage in him still not satisfied. Sheriff Brody came running, his hand on his gun. "That's enough! Rollins, you're under arrest for assault!" Eli turned to face him, his eyes like chips of ice. "The man he works for sent him to attack Cora Langley yesterday. You want to arrest someone? Arrest Rigg, or the animal lying at my feet." The sheriff's face hardened. He was a man who knew which side his bread was buttered on. "I don't know anything about that. All I see is you beating a man half to death in my street. I'm giving you a warning. Get on your horse and ride out of this town. If I see your face in redemption after sundown, I'll lock you up and throw away the key." Eli stared at the sheriff, a look of pure contempt on his face. He turned without another word and walked away. leaving Caleb groaning in the dirt and the sheriff standing with his empty threats. When he got back to the shack, Cora was waiting on the porch, her face filled with a new fear. The whole town was buzzing with the news. "They told me what you did," she said, her voice trembling. "Eli, you have to go. The sheriff will be back. Rig will send more men. They'll kill you." He walked past her into the shack. He picked up a hammer and a handful of nails. He went to the window that had been shot out, the one she had patched with a flimsy piece of board, and began to nail it shut, the hammer blows echoing like gunshots in the quiet afternoon. "Eli, please," she begged, following him. "Run! For me! I can't be the reason you get killed." He stopped hammering and turned to her. His face was hard, set in lines of grim determination. He looked at her, at the fear in her eyes, but also at the flicker of fight that was returning. He was not just protecting her body. He was protecting that flicker. "I'm done running," he said, his voice low and final. He picked up another board and moved to the other window. "Let them come." He raised the hammer again. "I'm not afraid of what's coming." The days after the fight were thick with a silence that was worse than noise. The boarded-up windows of Cora's shack were like closed, swollen eyes. Eli moved his few belongings from his camp by the creek and took up a permanent, silent vigil on her porch. He slept there at night, a dark shape wrapped in a blanket, his rifle never more than an arm's length away. He was a wall, and for the first time in 2 years, Cora slept through the night without a weapon by her bed. She did not feel safe. Safety was a luxury she had long since forgotten, but she no longer felt completely alone in her fear. The town treated them like ghosts. When they walked to the mercantile, a path would clear before them, conversations would cease, heads would turn away. They were an affliction, a scandal the town wished would simply disappear. Eli's presence had moved from being a curiosity to a crime, and Cora, by accepting his protection, had confirmed every dark suspicion they had ever held about her. Amos Rigg did not make his move for nearly a week. He was a patient man, a spider who preferred to let his victims exhaust themselves in the web before he struck. He waited for a night when the moon was a cold, silver coin in a cloudless sky, a night so still you could hear a leaf fall 100 yards away. It was the night Eli was due to guard the town well. "I have to go," he told Cora as dusk settled, his voice a low rumble. "It's the last night. I gave the preacher my word." A knot of fear tightened in Cora's stomach. "Do not go," she said, her hand resting on the rough wood of the porch rail. "Your word to a man who has turned his back on you means nothing. Stay here." "A man's word is all he has," Eli said, his face grim. "If I do not show, Rigg will use it as another excuse to have the sheriff lock me up for dereliction of duty. It will be a short watch. I will be back before the moon is high." He checked his rifle, his movements economical and precise. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding a warning. "Keep the door barred. Do not open it for anyone. Do not even light a lamp." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched him walk away, his tall frame swallowed by the deepening shadows, until he was gone. She went inside, dropped the heavy bar across the door, and sat in the darkness, her heart keeping a frantic, fearful rhythm. The attack came an hour later. It was not a single man this time. It was 3 of them, their faces masked by bandanas. She did not hear them approach. The first she knew of it was the sound of glass shattering as they broke the one window Eli had not boarded over, the small one in the back of the shack. Then came the smell, sharp and chemical, kerosene. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She scrambled away from the back wall just as a torch was tossed through the broken window. The oil-soaked floorboards erupted in a whoosh of flame. The fire was unnaturally fast, hungry. It devoured the dry wood of the old shack, spreading with a terrifying roar that swallowed the sound of the crickets and the whisper of the night wind. The men outside were laughing. She could hear their cruel, muffled voices through the growing inferno. This was not just a warning. This was an execution. The front door was already wreathed in flame. Smoke, thick and black, filled the small space, clawing at her lungs, making her eyes stream with tears. She could not breathe. She dropped to the floor, crawling, her mind a blank slate of pure terror. The heat was a physical blow, blistering her skin. The shack, her only refuge, her home, was becoming her coffin. She remembered the loose floorboard under her bed, the one Jeremiah had always meant to fix. She crawled toward it, her hands searching frantically in the choking darkness. She found the edge, dug her fingers in, and pulled. It came up with a screech of rusty nails. She squeezed through the narrow opening, dropping into the cool, dusty space beneath the house, just as the roof began to groan, preparing to collapse. She army crawled through the dirt and spider webs, past the stone pilings, and out from under the far side of the shack as the flames broke through the roof, a pillar of greedy orange light that stabbed at the night sky. She ran. She did not know where she was going. She just ran, barefoot, her nightgown torn, her lungs burning. She ran until she fell, her legs giving out from under her. She collapsed in the dirt 100 yards away and turned to watch her life burn. The fire was a living thing, a monstrous beast devouring her past, her present, her tiny, fragile island of hope, everything she owned, the few sentimental treasures from her mother, the bed she had slept in, the chairs they had sat on, the walls that had heard their whispered confessions. All of it was turning to smoke and ash. She wrapped her arms around herself and began to sob, a raw, animal sound of pure loss that was ripped from the deepest part of her soul. Eli saw the glow from his post at the well. He knew instantly what it was. A cold dread, colder than any winter night, washed over him. He abandoned his post and ran, his long legs eating up the distance, the ghost of another fire, another life lost, chasing him every step of the way. He ran with a prayer on his lips, a prayer to a God he no longer believed in, begging for a mercy he did not deserve. Please, not again. Let me not be too late again. He burst into the clearing and saw the shack, a roaring skeleton of fire against the stars. His heart stopped. He scanned the area, his eyes wild, searching for any sign of her. Then he saw her, a small, huddled shape in the dirt, her body shaking with violent sobs. She was alive. The relief that flooded him was so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He went to her, his footsteps silent on the scorched earth. He knelt beside her, his hand hovering over her soot-streaked back. "Cora," he said, his voice thick with smoke and emotion. She looked up, her face a mask of grief, streaked with tears and soot. Her eyes were wide with a devastation so complete it seemed to have broken the very foundations of her world. He had told her he would stay until she broke. That moment was now. He did not say another word. He scooped her up into his arms, her body as limp and light as a child's. She buried her face in his chest, her sobs muffled against his shirt. He held her tight and carried her away from the fire, away from the smoldering ruins of her life. He carried her to the only sanctuary he could think of, the place where they had first spoken, the old abandoned barn. He laid her down on a pile of clean straw in the corner, the same spot where they had sheltered from the sandstorm. The only light came from a single lantern he lit, its flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He brought her water from his canteen, holding it to her lips as she drank. She was still shaking, her teeth chattering, though the night was warm. He sat beside her, not knowing what to do, what to say. There were no words for this. There was no comfort he could offer that would rebuild a home or erase the terror from her eyes. He could only be there, a witness to her pain. She stopped crying after a long while, her sobs fading into shuddering breaths. She looked at him in the wavering lantern light. Her eyes were full of a terrible, aching emptiness. She reached out a trembling hand, just as she had on the porch, and laid it flat against his chest. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart. a counterpoint to the wild grief that was tearing her apart. Her touch was a question, a plea, a surrender. And this time, he did not pull away. He looked down at her hand, then into her eyes, and in their depths, he saw the reflection of his own brokenness, his own grief, all the walls he had built, all the miles he had run, all the years he had spent in a frozen, empty wasteland of his own making. It all came crashing down in that single moment. He leaned down and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was slow, fierce, desperate. It was a collision of grief and solace, a raw and hungry claiming in the face of utter loss. It tasted of smoke and tears and a sorrow so profound it had no name. She kissed him back with the same desperate intensity, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. This was not about love or romance. It was about survival. It was a desperate need to feel something other than pain, to anchor themselves to another living, breathing soul in a world that had tried its best to destroy them both. He laid her back on the rough straw mattress, his mouth never leaving hers. Their clothes were a hindrance, an unnecessary barrier, and they tore them away with trembling, fumbling hands, their bodies, revealed in the soft, forgiving light of the lantern, were maps of their hard lives. His scarred and lean from years on the trail, hers bruised and pale from a life of quiet suffering. There was no shame between them, only a raw, unvarnished truth. They came together not with grace, but with a raw, shuddering need. It was a frantic, almost violent coupling, a desperate attempt to forge a moment of life in the heart of so much death. It was two people clinging to each other on the edge of a cliff, their bodies saying what their words could not. You are not alone. I am here. We are still alive. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the straw, their bodies slick with sweat, the sound of their harsh breathing slowly quieting. The barn was silent save for the chirping of a cricket and the soft hiss of the lantern. Cora turned her face into Eli's shoulder and began to cry again. But these were different tears. They were not the wild sobs of terror and loss, but quiet, hot tears of release, a flood of all the pain and loneliness she had held inside for years. Eli held her, stroking her hair, his own eyes burning. He let her cry until she was empty. Then he tilted her chin up and gently kissed her tear-stained cheeks, his lips tasting the salt of her sorrow. You said stay, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. So I will. The news of the fire and its aftermath spread through Redemption like a plague. But there was no sympathy for Cora. The story, as told by Riggs' men and embroidered by the town gossips, was a simple and damning one. The homeless widow had sought shelter with the drifter. She was whoring herself in a barn for his protection. She had finally revealed the fallen woman she had been all along. The shunning became absolute. When Cora, wearing a faded dress Eli had bought her at the mercantile, walked through town, people did not just turn away. They looked at her with open contempt. A neighbor she had known for 10 years, Mrs. Hemlock, saw her coming, hawked and spat on the ground near her feet. The glob of spittle in the dust was a more eloquent condemnation than any sermon. Eli bore it with a stoic silence, his face a mask of granite. But inside, a dangerous pressure was building. He saw the way Cora flinched at every scornful look, the way she seemed to shrink into herself, the light he had briefly seen in her eyes dimming once more. The breaking point came 2 days later. Eli was in the sheriff's office, trying to file a formal complaint against Rigg for arson. Deputy Miller, the sheriff's sniveling nephew, was behind the desk. We have no proof it was Rigg, the deputy said with a smirk. Could have been anyone. Could have been a stray spark from her own hearth. Her hearth hadn't been lit in a week, Eli said, his voice dangerously low. And there were 3 sets of boot prints. You would know that if you had bothered to investigate. Look, Rollins, the deputy said, leaning back in his chair, enjoying his small moment of power. Maybe you should just take your woman and move on. There is nothing for you here. Nobody wants a woman like that in a decent town. She is damaged goods. The word hit Eli like a punch to the gut. Damaged. The same word the town used. The same lie he had refuted. He saw a flash of Cora's bruised face. Heard the echo of her broken whisper in the night. The pressure inside him exploded. He did not say a word. He reached across the desk, grabbed the front of the deputy's shirt, and hauled him over it. He hit him once. A single, clean, powerful blow to the jaw. The deputy's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed on the floor, out cold. Sheriff Brody burst in from the back room, his gun drawn. "Rollins, you have gone too far this time!" Eli stood over the unconscious deputy, his chest heaving, his knuckles bleeding. He looked at the sheriff with eyes that held no fear, only a cold, deadly promise. That evening, the preacher visited them at the barn. He found Eli sitting outside, cleaning his rifle, while Cora tried to sweep the dusty floor inside. "Eli," the preacher said, his voice heavy with a grim resignation, "you cannot win this fight. You assaulted a lawman. Rigg owns the sheriff and will soon own the judge. If you stay, you will be hanged for murder or hunted down for the bounty Rigg is sure to place on your head. You must leave. Tonight." Eli continued to methodically clean his weapon. "And Cora?" he asked without looking up. The preacher sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Rigg only wants the land. Once you are gone, he will have no more use for her. He will leave her be." "You believe that?" Eli asked, finally looking up. His eyes were hard. "Do you believe he would let her live in peace after what he has done? After what I have done?" The preacher had no answer. The next morning, Cora woke to find Eli gone. A cold dread washed over her. He had left. The preacher's words had finally convinced him. She was alone again. Then she heard a sound from outside, a steady, rhythmic chipping. She went to the barn door and looked out. Eli was sitting in the field where her house used to be. Between his knees was a large, flat piece of sandstone he had hauled from the creek bed. With a hammer and a chisel, he was slowly, carefully, carving words into its surface. He worked for hours under the hot sun, his movements patient and deliberate. When he was finished, he dug a hole in the ground, right where her front porch had been. He lifted the heavy stone and set it in the earth. It looked like a headstone, a marker for a grave. Cora walked out to him, her bare feet silent in the dusty soil. She stood beside him and read the words he had carved into the stone. They were simple, stark, and heartbreakingly beautiful. Home was here. The stone marker was an act of war, and Amos Rigg answered in kind. The following morning, Sheriff Brody nailed a notice to the post outside his office. It was a formal declaration, written in a stark, black script. Eli Rollins was now a wanted man, an outlaw charged with aggravated assault on a peace officer and disturbing the peace. The charge was a flimsy pretext, but it was official. It gave any man with a gun the legal right to hunt him. To ensure they had the motivation, Rigg added his own notice beneath the sheriff's. A bounty, $200 in gold coin for the man who brought Eli Rollins in, dead or alive. The sum was a fortune in a town slowly starving to death. It turned every shadow into a threat, every stranger's glance into a calculation. The barn was no longer a shelter. It was a prison. "This is what he wanted," Cora said, her voice a tight, fearful whisper. She had seen the notices on her rare, hurried trip to the mercantile. "He has made you a target for every desperate man in the territory." Eli stood by the barn door, staring out at the scorched patch of earth where her home had been. The stone marker caught the morning light, a defiant gray tooth in the ravaged landscape. "He thinks he can buy this town's fear," Eli said, his voice low and hard. "But a man driven by hunger is not the same as a man driven by loyalty. Rigg has no allies, only employees." "Employees with guns," she countered. "Who will shoot you in the back for a bag of gold?" "Then I will have to make sure they never see my back," he said. He turned to her, and the cold, weary look of the drifter was gone. In its place was the focused, dangerous intensity of a lawman building a case. Fighting Rig with fists is a fool's game. Brody is his puppet, and his hired guns are cowards. But there is a power even Rig has to answer to. The circuit judge is due in redemption in 2 weeks. Judge Morrison, I knew him. Years ago. He is a hard man, but he is an honest one. If we can give him proof of Rig's crimes, he will break him. Hope, a feeling so foreign it was almost painful, flickered in Cora's chest. What kind of proof? Rig's power is not just in his guns, it is in the water. Eli began to pace the length of the barn, his steps restless. The main aquifer that feeds this valley runs under his land. He dammed the spring that fed the town creek, the one that is now a dry bed. He claims it is his legal right, but I have heard whispers, men who say he dynamited another, smaller spring on public land, diverting its flow to his own reservoir. He is not just controlling the water, he is stealing it from this town, from the farmers, from the earth itself, and then he sells it back to them at a price that bleeds them dry. That is a federal crime. We need proof, ledgers, maps, someone who is willing to testify. And so their quiet routine of survival transformed into a secret, desperate conspiracy. The barn became their headquarters. During the day, Eli would stay hidden, cleaning his weapons, studying a map of the county he had acquired, while Cora kept watch. She became his eyes and ears, gathering snippets of conversation at the store, noting which of Rig's men rode where, her seemingly aimless walks now filled with a spy's purpose. At night, Eli would slip out, a ghost in the darkness. He met with disgruntled farmers on the outskirts of town, men who had lost their land to Rig's predatory water prices. Most were too terrified to speak, but a few, their lives already ruined, were willing to tell their stories. Eli wrote down their testimonies, his rough scrawl filling page after page of a small leather-bound book. He found a disgraced surveyor in a saloon 2 towns over, a man with a tremor in his hands and a powerful thirst, who, for the price of a bottle of whiskey, drew a crude map of the valley's water table, confirming Eli's suspicions about the dynamited spring. Cora was the keeper of these secrets. She hid the papers in a loose stone in the barn's foundation. She memorized the names of the men who spoke to Eli, their faces, their stories. The bond between them deepened, forged in the crucible of their shared danger. The frantic, desperate passion of their first night in the barn cooled and settled into something stronger, more resilient. It was no longer the coming together of 2 broken people seeking solace, but the quiet, steady partnership of 2 soldiers fighting the same war. It was a bond of unwavering devotion. She would watch him leave in the darkness, her heart in her throat, and he would return before dawn, his face etched with weariness, and find her waiting with a cup of hot coffee and a silent, steadying presence. One evening, as a storm gathered on the horizon, the air thick and heavy with unshed rain, Cora sat on a hay bale, mending another tear in Eli's shirt. Eli was studying the surveyor's map by the light of the lantern. The silence between them was comfortable, a familiar blanket. Cora put down her sewing and picked up the one book she had managed to save from the fire. It had been in her apron pocket that night. It was her mother's Bible, small and worn, its leather cover softened by the touch of 2 generations of hands. "My mother used to read to me from this every night," she said softly. She said the words were a shield against the dark. Eli looked up from his map, his expression unreadable. Cora opened the book, its pages thin and fragile. She found the passage she was looking for, a psalm her mother had loved. Her voice was quiet but clear in the still air of the barn. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall be afraid?" She looked up at him. "Do you think that is true? That there is a light that can save us?" Eli was quiet for a long time, his gaze lost in the flickering flame of the lantern. "I told you once, Cora, I stopped believing in God in the ashes of my home. I looked for a light, and all I found was darkness." He looked at her then, at her tired, hopeful face, at the small, worn book in her hands. A deep, aching honesty came into his eyes. "I do not believe in his light anymore," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely showed. "But I want to believe in you." The confession was more intimate than any kiss, more profound than any embrace. He was a man adrift in a godless world, and he was telling her that she was his one true point of navigation, his only star. Tears welled in her eyes, and she closed the book, holding it to her chest. In that moment, she knew she would follow him into any darkness, face any fire, as long as they could face it together. 2 nights later, Eli went to meet the last piece of their puzzle. A former foreman of rigs, a man named Silas, had sent word that he was willing to talk. He had supervised the blasting at the second spring and had kept the records Rig had ordered him to burn. He was consumed by guilt and fear, but his wife was sick, and he needed money to move her to a healthier climate. He was willing to trade the ledger for $100 and a promise of protection from the judge. The meeting was set for a remote line shack in the hills west of town. Eli took every precaution, circling the shack twice, listening to the night sounds. Before he approached, Silas was there, a nervous, haunted man who handed over a thin, leather-bound ledger in exchange for the money Eli had carefully saved. The book was a damning record of Rig's theft, with dates, names, and figures that would be impossible to deny. It was the final nail for Rig's coffin. Eli rode back toward the barn, the ledger tucked safely inside his shirt. The moon was hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds, and the trail was dark. He was less than a mile from the barn when the shot rang out. It came from the rocks above the trail, a deafening crack that spooked his horse. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in his back. He cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, as another bullet tore through his shoulder. He fell from the saddle, his body hitting the hard-packed earth with a sickening thud. His horse, panicked, galloped off into the night. He lay in the dust, the world tilting and fading to black. He could hear the crunch of boots on the gravel as 2 men approached. He recognized their voices. They were 2 of Rig's hired guns. "Is he dead?" one asked. "He is good as," the other said with a cruel laugh. "Let the coyotes finish the job. Rig said he wanted it to look like a robbery gone bad." They roughly searched his pockets. Taking the few coins he had left, they missed the ledger, still tucked inside his shirt, protected by his body. They kicked him once in the ribs for good measure, then melted back into the darkness. Eli lay there, his life bleeding out into the thirsty ground. The pain was a living thing, a fire that consumed him. He tried to move, to call out, but his limbs would not obey, and his voice was only a pained whisper. He thought of the fire, of Sarah and Luke. He thought he could see them, waiting for him across that river of blood. Then, through the haze of pain, another face appeared. Cora. He clung to her image, a single point of light in the encroaching darkness. He could not leave her. Not now. He had promised he would stay. Cora knew something was wrong. It was nearly dawn, and he had not returned. A frantic, clawing fear seized her. She took a lantern and his spare pistol and went out to look for him. She saw his horse first, grazing nervously near the trail, its reins trailing. Then she saw the scuff marks in the dust, the dark, ugly stain. She followed the trail of it with the lantern, her heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She found him in a shallow ditch by the side of the trail. He was so still, so pale in the lantern light, that she thought he was dead. A scream caught in her throat. Then she saw the faint, shallow rise and fall of his chest. He was alive, barely. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over his wounds. Not knowing what to do, the town was impossible. The doctor would report it to the sheriff, and they would come and finish the job Rig's men had started. She was on her own. She remembered a place, a small, hidden cave in the cliffs behind her burned-out property. She and the other children had played there years ago, before they had learned to shun her. It was dry and sheltered. If she could get him there, she might have a chance. She did not know how she did it. The strength came from some deep, primal well of desperation. He was a heavy man, and she was small, but she managed to get him onto his horse. She walked beside the animal, one hand holding Eli upright in the saddle, the other holding the reins, and led him slowly, agonizingly, toward the cliffs. The cave was small, barely a hollow in the rock face, but it was hidden by a thick growth of juniper and sage. She eased him from the horse and dragged him inside. She tore strips from her own petticoat to pack his wounds, trying to stanch the bleeding. She ran back and forth to a small, hidden spring for water. She washed the blood from his skin, her hands gentle, her face a mask of determined terror. He was burning with fever, his body slick with sweat. For 2 days and 2 nights, she did not sleep. She nursed him, cooling his forehead with damp cloths, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness, lost in a fevered delirium. He mumbled and tossed, his hands reaching for things that were not there. On the second night, as a storm raged outside, he began to speak. His eyes were open but unseeing, staring into the past. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping sound. "The smoke, I cannot see you. Luke, where is your pistol, son? I will fix it for you. Sarah." Cora froze, her hand pausing on his forehead. A pain sharper than any she had ever known lanced through her heart. He was dying, and it was his wife he was calling for. She was just a footnote at the end of his life, a temporary caretaker. All her hopes, all the fragile devotion they had built, turned to ash in her mouth. She was nothing but a ghost tending to a man haunted by other ghosts. She bowed her head, hot tears of grief and despair finally falling onto his chest. He had fought for her, but his heart, his soul, was still buried in the ashes of his past. Then he shifted, his head turning on the rolled-up blanket that served as his pillow. His eyes, for a brief moment, seemed to focus on her. "Cora," he whispered, his voice so faint it was almost lost in the sound of the wind. Her name. He had said her name. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears. He was not just seeing a ghost from his past. He was seeing her, here, now. She was not a replacement. She was something else, something new, a part of the life he had now. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, the one that had been destroyed and the one they were trying so desperately to build. She took his hand, her grip fierce, possessive. She leaned close to his ear, her voice a raw, determined whisper. "Listen to me, Eli Rollins," she said, her tears still falling. "She is gone, but I am here, and I am not a saint like she was. I am just a stubborn, difficult woman who will not let you die in this cave." She squeezed his hand harder. "I am already broken. You told me so yourself. You said I was whole, so you can stop trying to fix me by dying for me. You can stop trying to atone for what you could not do for them. You just have to come back. Do you hear me? Come back." He did not answer. His eyes slipped closed again, and he fell back into the depths of the fever. But his hand, the one she was holding, gave a faint, almost imperceptible twitch, a sign that somewhere, in the darkness, he had heard her. He survived. It was a close thing, a battle fought hour by hour in the dark, damp cave. The fever broke on the 3rd day. The bleeding stopped. He woke, his eyes clear but filled with a deep, consuming pain. He lived. But the man who had walked into the cave would not be the man who walked out. The bullet in his shoulder had healed clean, but the one in his back was lodged deep, too close to his spine for her to dare to remove it. It left him with a deep, permanent limp, a constant, grinding pain that would be his companion for the rest of his days. The violence of redemption had marked him, had taken a piece of him that could never be recovered. He had survived, but he would never again be whole. Judge Alastair Morrison arrived in Redemption on the back of a tired-looking mule, accompanied by two grim-faced federal marshals. He was a man carved from the same hard country he judged, with a face like a weathered rock, and eyes that seemed to have already seen and dismissed every lie a man could invent. He did not set up court in the saloon or the sheriff's office, but in the church, as if to remind the town that justice, in its purest form, was a sacred and unforgiving thing. For 10 days, Eli had been a prisoner in the cave, his body slowly, painfully mending. The ledger Silas had given him, stained with his own blood, was a constant heavy weight in his thoughts. Cora was his lifeline. She tended his wounds, brought him food and water, and was the conduit for their desperate plan. The day after the judge arrived, she walked not to the church, but to the preacher's parsonage. Reverend Miller answered the door, his face a mask of weary anxiety. He had seen the bounty notices. He had heard the whispers about Eli's disappearance. He expected Cora to ask for charity, for protection. He did not expect her to hold out a blood-stained ledger. "This is the proof Eli found," she said, her voice low and steady. "It is a record of every drop of water Amos Rigg has stolen from this valley. Eli was shot trying to bring this back. He is alive, but he is badly wounded." The preacher stared at the book as if it were a coiled snake. This was the precipice of his life. He could close the door, pretend she had never come, and continue to lead his flock in their quiet, managed fear. Or he could finally stand for the God of justice he preached about every Sunday. "The farmers who testified to Eli, they are afraid," Cora pressed, seeing the hesitation in his eyes. "They will not come forward on their own. They need a shepherd to lead them. Eli cannot do it. He can barely stand." The choice was made. The next morning, when Judge Morrison called the court to order, the church doors opened, and Reverend Miller walked in. He was not alone. Behind him, looking terrified but resolute, were 4 of the farmers whose land had been desiccated by Rigg's greed. And beside the preacher, her head held high, was Cora Langley. The townspeople, gathered in the pews out of morbid curiosity, began to murmur. Amos Rigg, who sat in the front pew like a visiting king, turned and stared, a look of cold fury dawning on his face. "Your Honor," the preacher began, his voice shaking but clear, "there is a matter of grave injustice in this town, a matter of theft, of violence, and of attempted murder. I have come to speak for a man who cannot be here to speak for himself." For the next 2 hours, the preacher laid out the case. He presented the farmers, who gave their sworn, halting testimonies of Rigg's threats and predatory pricing. He presented the surveyor's map, showing the illegal diversion of the public spring. And finally, with a hand that had stopped shaking, he presented the blood-stained ledger. Rigg's lawyer, a slick man from the Capitol, objected with every legal term he knew, but Judge Morrison waved him into silence, his eyes fixed on the numbers in the book. He listened to the entire story, his expression never changing. When the preacher was finished, an absolute silence fell over the church. "This is a compelling and deeply disturbing accusation. Reverend," the judge said, his voice a low gravel. "But it is all circumstantial. The word of frightened men in a book that could be a forgery. Is there anyone who can attest to the provenance of this ledger? Anyone who saw it being written?" The doors at the back of the church creaked open. Every head turned. Eli Rollins stood there, leaning heavily on a crudely fashioned crutch. He was pale, gaunt, and his face was etched with a pain that went deeper than his wounds, but he was standing. Cora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had begged him not to come, to wait until his strength returned, but his stubborn will was a force she could not contain. He walked down the aisle, his left leg dragging, each step an obvious agony. The sound of his crutch striking the wooden floor was the only sound in the room. He did not look at the townspeople. He did not look at Rigg. He walked to the front of the church and stood before the judge, his gray eyes burning with a cold, clear light. "I can, Your Honor," he said, his voice raspy but strong. "I got that ledger from a man named Silas Croft, a former foreman of Mr. Riggs, and I was shot in the back by two of Mr. Riggs' men for carrying it." He looked at Rigg for the first time, a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. He does not like his secrets being told. Rigg leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage. "This is an outrage! This man is a wanted outlaw, a vagrant, a killer!" "He is a man with evidence," the judge said calmly. He looked at his marshals. "Place Mr. Rigg under arrest for suspicion of federal water theft, conspiracy, and attempted murder." The town watched, stunned into silence, as the marshals clamped irons on Amos Rigg's wrists. His reign was over. The tyranny of thirst and fear that had held redemption in its grip for years was broken, not by a posse of heroes, but by a wounded drifter, a shunned widow, and a preacher who had finally found his courage. The aftermath was not a celebration. The townspeople did not suddenly embrace Cora and Eli as their saviors. A deep-seated resentment and shame kept them distant. They had allowed Rigg's evil to fester among them, and the outcasts they had scorned were the ones who had been forced to lance the boil. They remained cold toward Cora, but the open hostility was gone. The whispers ceased. The spitting stopped. She was no longer a target, just an uncomfortable reminder of their own cowardice. They left her in peace, which was all she had ever really wanted. Eli's recovery was slow and incomplete. The wounds healed into puckered, angry scars, but the pain in his back remained, a constant, nagging ache that worsened in the cold. The limp was permanent. His days of riding long distances, of drifting from one horizon to the next, were over. His body had become its own kind of prison. A week after the trial, he stood with Cora on the patch of land where her house had burned. The stone he had carved stood sentinel over the ashes. The life he had known was gone, taken from him just as surely as his first life had been taken by the fire. He was unmoored, a ship without a rudder. "My horse is rested," he said, not looking at her. I should be able to make it to the next town if I take it slow." Cora's heart constricted. She had known this moment was coming. He was a drifter. It was all he knew how to be. "But this leg," he continued, his voice rough with a vulnerability she had never heard before. "Riding is not what it used to be. A man who cannot ride fast is not a man who can outrun trouble, and trouble seems to find me." He finally turned to her, his gray eyes stripped bare of all his defenses. He looked lost and tired, and achingly human. "Cora, I do not know how to stay in one place, but I do not think I can leave this one. Is it all right if I stay?" A slow, brilliant smile spread across Cora's face, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and lit them from within. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile, and it was like watching the sunrise after a long, dark night. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of a joy so profound it was almost painful. "Yes, Eli," she whispered. "You can stay." They rebuilt. With the bounty money the judge had insisted Eli take for bringing Rigg to justice. They bought lumber and nails and glass for the windows. They worked side by side, from sunup to sundown. He, with his powerful arms and aching back, would set the heavy beams. She, with her quick, capable hands, would hammer the planks. The new shack rose from the ashes of the old one. Smaller, perhaps, but stronger. Its foundations built not just on stone, but on a shared resolve. When the house was finished, they did not stop. Cora took a spade and began to turn over the ashen soil around the foundation. Eli watched her for a moment, then took up a shovel and worked beside her. They cleared the scorched earth, and in its place, they planted wildflowers, seeds she had carefully collected from the hillsides. It was a defiant act of hope, a promise that life could, and would, grow again from the ruins. Their love was quieter now. The frantic, desperate fire of their first nights together had burned down to a steady, glowing warmth that did not go out. It was a love that lived in the small, unspoken moments. It was in the way she would have a hot compress ready for his back at the end of a long day. It was in the way he would watch her, a look of quiet wonder on his face, as she tended the first green shoots that pushed their way through the dark soil. It was in the shared silences that were no longer empty, but full of a deep and abiding peace. The seasons turned. The wildflowers bloomed, a riot of color against the gray-green landscape. The town of Redemption, free of Rig's grip, slowly began to breathe again. The creek began to trickle with water diverted back to its natural course. The people still kept their distance, but the respect in their eyes when they looked at the small, rebuilt shack on the edge of town was undeniable. Winter came, harsh and unforgiving. The wind howled down from the mountains, piling snow in deep drifts against the walls of the shack. But inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, and the small home was filled with a gentle warmth. On the coldest night of the year, Cora lay beside Eli under a thick quilt she had made from scraps of old cloth. The only light was the soft, orange glow from the embers in the fireplace. Outside, the wind shrieked like a banshee, a reminder of all the chaos and violence they had endured. But in here, in this small, safe space they had built together, there was only a profound and sacred stillness. Cora snuggled closer to his warmth, her head resting on his good shoulder. She thought of the long road that had brought them to this moment, the pain, the fear, the loss. "You stayed," she whispered into the darkness, the words a simple statement of a miracle she still could not quite comprehend. He was quiet for a long moment. He reached out and gently traced the line of her jaw with his calloused fingers. "You broke me," he answered, his voice a low, rough murmur against her hair. "In the right place." Outside, the wind howled on, relentless and wild. But inside, shielded by walls they had built with their own hands and a love forged in the heart of tragedy, there was the soft, steady light of something that would never be extinguished. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to connect with all of you, so please comment with where you are listening from, subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and share your thoughts with us in English.